They held back the rivers, but one mistake was enough for the elements to break free. Dams destroyed, cities swept away, and thousands of lives lost in the floodwaters. These are the top 5 worst dam and dike disasters where man lost the battle with nature. On October 7, 2025, in Lang Son Province, Vietnam, after several days of continuous heavy rain and stormy winds, a partial breach occurred in the dam of the Small Back Key hydroelectric power station. It was a localized breach in a critical location. A 5-meter section of the wall gave way under the pressure of the water, and the torrent rushed down the gorge, washing away fences, eroding roads, and flooding gardens and rice fields. In the first hours after the breach, the scene was chaotic. Muddy water rushed through the valleys, sweeping away buildings and destroying bridges that locals used to go to the market. Local authorities and rescuers acted quickly. Sirens were sounded, civil defense units, fire brigades and volunteers were mobilized, and evacuation corridors were organized to get people out of the immediate danger zone. Thanks to the coordinated efforts, approximately 700 people were evacuated. Many families left their homes in a hurry during the night, taking their most valuable possessions and pets with them, and this saved lives. According to official data, there were no casualties. The operation was fraught with difficulties. Washed-out roads hindered the delivery of equipment, so boats and off-road vehicles had to be used, and the elderly and children had to be carried across flooded areas by hand. Once the situation stabilized, damage assessment began. Engineers inspected the damaged section and concluded that the breach was caused by a combination of factors: record rainfall, soil saturation, material fatigue, and insufficient preparation for extreme flood loads. Locals had previously complained about cracks and seepage in the lower part of the dam, but large-scale repairs were delayed due to lack of funding and bureaucracy, leaving the structure vulnerable to record flooding. The environmental consequences were serious. Household waste, agricultural chemicals, and silt entered the rivers along with the water, causing temporary damage to crops and threatening local ecosystems. Experts also noted the risk of disruption to the drinking water supply in a number of villages due to muddy water and pollution. The economic damage was measured not only in terms of destroyed houses and lost crops, but also in terms of the shutdown of mini hydroelectric power plants, which led to local power outages and losses for small businesses. In response to the accident, regional and national resources were mobilized. Engineering teams arrived, equipment was brought in to temporarily reinforce the banks and overflow channels, and the design of restoration work began. An important detail was the public reaction. People demanded a transparent investigation and punishment of those responsible, while at the same time initiatives were launched to organize mutual assistance, raise funds, and distribute humanitarian aid. The investigation highlighted several key problems: insufficient monitoring of the dam's condition, a weak warning system, and gaps in the regulations for servicing small hydropower plants in the context of accelerating climate extremes. The scientific and engineering communities have pointed out that such small facilities can pose a serious threat if they are not integrated into a risk assessment system and equipped with sensors and rapid water discharge capabilities. This means conducting regular inspections, reinforcing flow elements, calculating throughput capacity, and developing clear evacuation plans that should be rehearsed in advance, especially in mountainous areas. Eyewitness accounts about families fighting off the waves, a village teacher who led elderly people across a thin plank to a boat, a rescuer who returned for a forgotten puppy, illustrated the value of rapid response and human solidarity. The restoration work involved not only repairing the damaged section, but also rethinking safety approaches, revising design standards for small hydropower facilities, strengthening operational controls, and creating insurance programs for rural communities. The Back Key Dam breach was a painful reminder that, under the influence of climate change, even small engineering structures can turn water power into a threat to people, and that investing in prevention rather than restoration is the economically sensible and humanitarianly imperative path for regions dependent on vulnerable infrastructure. Local and international organizations have proposed recovery and adaptation programs, creating risk maps and building additional barriers, restoring forest strips along rivers to reduce erosion and silt accumulation, and implementing educational programs for communities on flood behavior and evacuation procedures. Funding will come partly from government reserves and international aid, and partly through insurance schemes and private investment in sustainable infrastructure. The administration has announced tighter controls on small hydroelectric facilities. Inspection regulations will be updated, mandatory strength tests will be introduced, and reporting and transparency requirements for contractors will be increased. Experts are developing a digital monitoring platform that will collect real-time data on water pressure, precipitation, and structural deformations, and emergency services will receive immediate alerts. Temporary relocation and compensation programs are planned, as well as the provision of seeds and equipment for crop restoration and subsidies for small businesses. Critics note that there are many promises, but systemic financing and political will remain key. Recovery will take years. Strengthening dams, restoring infrastructure and the environment, and rebuilding trust between residents and authorities. The story of Back Key has become material for training seminars among hydraulic engineers and shows that a combination of worn-out structures and extreme weather conditions can affect everyone. The disaster at the Quatorze de Julho Dam in the state of Rio Grande do Sul was one of the most devastating man-made events of the spring of 2024, when record rainfall and prolonged precipitation exceeded the capacity of the hydro network. Part of the dam could not withstand the pressure and a partial breach occurred, spilling an avalanche of water and silt into the valleys. The day before, residents had noted unprecedented water levels and warned of possible flooding, but the speed and force of the flow exceeded all expected scenarios. Powerful waves rushed downstream, washing away the banks and destroying infrastructure, and as a result, the cities of Cotipara and Bento Gonçalves found themselves at the epicenter of the disaster. Streets turned into wide rivers, transport arteries and bridges were destroyed, residential areas were flooded, many houses were washed away, and roofs became the only islands in the flooded streets. The most tragic aspect of this disaster was the loss of life. According to official data, at least 37 people died, a bitter reminder of the importance of timely evacuation and high-quality warning systems. Thousands of people lost their homes and were placed in temporary shelters, where volunteers and medical teams provided first aid and support. The first hours after the breach were marked by chaos and panic. Emergency services worked in conditions of disrupted communications. People had to be transported by boats and off-road vehicles. Many areas remained inaccessible due to destroyed roads and landslides, and rescuers were faced with the need to make quick decisions under time constraints. Hospitals were overflowing with victims, medical workers were providing assistance in field conditions, and health services were raising the alarm about the risk of infections due to contaminated water and destroyed sewage systems. The environmental damage was significant. Household and industrial waste, agricultural chemicals, and tons of sludge were washed into rivers and soil, damaging crops and threatening local flora and fauna. And restoring normal water quality and soil fertility would require a long-term effort. The economic losses were estimated to be substantial. Destroyed crops, livestock, ruined farms, and suspended factory and business operations deprived thousands of people of their livelihoods. Small businesses and rural communities were particularly hard hit, for whom recovery meant years of hard work and external assistance. Regional and federal forces were immediately mobilized in response to the disaster. Engineering units arrived, heavy equipment was brought in to clear debris and reinforce eroded sections of the coastline, and work began on providing temporary protection for vulnerable areas and organizing a steady flow of humanitarian aid. Local community organizations and international donors joined forces to deliver essential supplies, set up feeding stations and temporary accommodation, while volunteers took on the task of collecting and distributing resources. An investigation into the causes of the collapse revealed a combination of factors: unusually heavy rainfall, outdated dam structures, inadequate maintenance and monitoring, and miscalculations in risk assessment during the design and operation of the hydroelectric facility. Previous complaints from local residents about cracks and water seepage at the bottom of the dam, as well as observations of increased moisture in the foundation, were warning signs that were not fully taken into account due to bureaucratic delays and limited funding for preventive repairs. The public outcry was enormous. Relatives of the dead and displaced demanded a transparent investigation and punishment of those responsible, as well as compensation and swift measures to restore housing and infrastructure. At the same time, discussions flared up about the need for reforms in the standardization of small and medium-sized hydroelectric facilities, the introduction of modern monitoring and automatic control systems for water levels and pressure, the creation of early warning systems for downstream settlements, and the financing of preventive maintenance programs. Engineers proposed specific measures: strengthening the reinforcement of problematic sections, reconstructing overflow channels, increasing throughput capacity, and creating emergency diversions, as well as integrating digital sensors and platforms that transmit data in real time to control centers, where specialists could respond more quickly to critical changes. The social aspect proved to be no less important. Restoring trust between residents and authorities required not only technical solutions, but also transparent communications, direct dialogue, and community participation in planning adaptation measures. Temporary shelters became centers for coordinating aid in places where people exchanged information and supported each other, while stories of rescue and heroism by volunteers and rescuers became a clear example of how solidarity can mitigate the effects of even the most severe disasters. The recovery plan provided for a phased program: priority restoration of access to clean water and electricity, repair of roads and bridges, restoration of housing and infrastructure, followed by long-term projects to rehabilitate river valleys and agricultural landscapes, as well as an economic support program for affected families and small businesses. The authorities announced a review of safety standards, mandatory inspections of all small hydropower plants, and the creation of an emergency fund to cover the costs of immediate reinforcement and evacuation work. Despite these promises, many experts warned that without a systemic overhaul of the approach to water management and without significant investment in prevention, similar disasters could recur, especially against the backdrop of increasing climate extremes. The disaster at the 14 de Julho Dam was not only a tragedy for the affected communities, but also a lesson for the entire country and the international community. The combination of aging infrastructure and powerful climate challenges requires a rethinking of priorities and investment in sustainability, because prevention and competent planning are always more economically and humanely beneficial than dealing with the consequences. On April 5, 2024, one of the largest man-made disasters in modern Russian history occurred in the city of Orsk. The dam holding back the waters of the Ural River burst. This happened early in the morning, when the water level rose to a critical point after rapid snowmelt, and the worn-out structures could not withstand the enormous pressure. The flow broke through the protective embankment and rushed towards the city, sweeping away everything in its path. The powerful wave reached several meters in height, engulfing residential areas, industrial zones, and roads. In a matter of minutes, the water flooded hundreds of streets, turning the city into a huge lake. People sought refuge by climbing onto roofs, ascending to attics, clinging to trees and handy objects. Some areas were completely cut off from the mainland and could only be reached by boat or helicopter. Rescue services began working in extreme conditions. Communications were disrupted, roads were destroyed, electricity was cut off, and the weather prevented the use of light aircraft. Despite this, evacuation points were set up within the first few hours, and rescuers began to transport people to safe areas. According to official data, more than 15 people died, but eyewitnesses claimed that the actual number could be higher, as some residents were trapped in flooded houses and did not have time to escape. More than 10,000 homes were affected by the disaster, and thousands of families lost their homes and possessions. The scale of the destruction was enormous. Schools, hospitals, shops, and power lines were flooded, and the water even reached the upper floors of some buildings. The city remained partially underwater for several days, and only after the water level dropped did the extent of the damage become clear. Economic losses were estimated at billions of rubles. Infrastructure was destroyed, roads were washed away, and water supply and sewage systems were out of order. Experts cited a combination of factors as the main cause of the disaster: heavy snowmelt, which sharply increased the flow of water into the river, wear and tear on the dam built decades ago, and errors in reservoir management. According to the investigation, at the critical moment, water was not released in a timely manner, which led to increased pressure on the dam. In addition, microcracks were found in the structure, which had been reported earlier, but repair work was never carried out. The city was not prepared for a disaster of this magnitude. The warning system was delayed, and many residents only learned of the breach when the water was already approaching their homes. People filmed what was happening on their phones, trying to figure out what to do, and shared the videos on social media, which instantly spread across the country. By the evening of the same day, a convoy of emergency services, military engineers, divers, and volunteers from neighboring regions had arrived in Orsk. Temporary accommodation centers were set up, kitchens, field hospitals, and humanitarian aid warehouses were deployed. The authorities declared a state of emergency, and the president expressed his condolences to the families of the victims and ordered a thorough investigation. Journalists and social activists began to raise the question of responsibility. Why was a hydraulic structure, on whose safety millions of rubles had been spent, in such a dangerous condition? The investigation revealed systemic problems: a lack of proper control over the condition of the dam, a formal approach to inspections, and bureaucratic red tape in the allocation of funds for repairs. Local residents said that several weeks before the tragedy, they had noticed water seeping through the concrete and even contacted the administration, but received only vague promises. After the breach, a second wave of outrage followed. Many believed that the authorities had underestimated the scale of the threat and had not taken timely measures to evacuate the area. At the same time, search and rescue operations began, which lasted for weeks. Divers surveyed the flooded areas, retrieved cars and bodies of the dead, and specialists assessed the condition of the structures to prevent new breaches. One of the consequences of the disaster was an environmental problem. The floodwaters washed away pollution, oil products, rubbish and sewage, which spread across the lowlands and threatened the soil and groundwater. After the water receded, massive efforts began to disinfect and clean up the area, pump out water and restore power. The restoration of the city became a national endeavor. Thousands of people worked without days off. Volunteers from all over the country helped the victims, and charitable foundations raised funds to rebuild homes and support families. At the same time, public distrust of official reports grew. Many believed that the true causes of the disaster were being hushed up to conceal negligence and corruption. Engineers involved in analyzing the consequences emphasized that such structures require constant monitoring and regular reconstruction, especially in the context of a changing climate and increasing seasonal rainfall. They pointed out that hydraulic structures age, which means that the risk of destruction increases every year if preventive maintenance is replaced by formal inspections. The dam breach in Orsk became a symbol of the vulnerability of old infrastructure and a bitter reminder that negligence can cost dozens of lives. This event forced a rethink of the approach to the safety of such facilities throughout the country. Urgent inspections of all dams, dikes, and reservoirs began, and control and reporting requirements were tightened. However, for the residents of Orsk, these measures came too late. They lost their homes, memories, loved ones, and faith in the protection that nature itself was supposed to provide, but which the man-made wall failed to deliver. On June 6, 2023, Ukraine faced one of the most severe man-made disasters in its modern history: the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant on the Dnieper River, an event that instantly changed the lives of millions of people and radically transformed the landscape of the lower reaches of the river. The dam, which had long served as a source of energy, water regulation, and irrigation support for the region, suddenly ceased to function. Huge masses of water broke through the structure and rushed down the riverbed, forming a destructive wave that swept away bridges, roads, houses, and farm buildings in a matter of hours. People woke up in the middle of the night to the roaring noise, looked out of their windows, and saw their familiar streets turning into raging torrents. Many managed to grab only the bare essentials, while others were trapped, climbing onto roofs and trees to wait for help. The scale of the destruction was enormous. Dozens of settlements were flooded, hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless, thousands of hectares of agricultural land were underwater or covered with silt, and farm buildings and crops were destroyed. The flood resulted in human casualties and numerous injuries. The consequences for public health were exacerbated by the destruction of water supply and sanitation systems, the spread of contaminated water, and the threat of infection. Rescue services, volunteers, and the military worked around the clock to evacuate people and animals and set up temporary shelters and field hospitals, but resources were limited given the scale of the disaster. Many areas were inaccessible due to strong currents and debris, and in some areas it was necessary to work manually, putting rescuers at risk. The environmental consequences were catastrophic. Millions of cubic meters of water bursting from the reservoir washed away fertile soil, eroded floodplain forests, destroyed fish and bird habitats, and carried tons of silt, domestic and industrial waste, and agrochemicals into the lowlands. The result was mass fish kills, a decline in waterfowl populations, and long-lasting changes in the aquatic ecosystem, the consequences of which scientists have been assessing for years. The irrigation system that supplied vast areas of agricultural land was disrupted. Canals dried up or became filled with sediment, farmers lost crops and harvests. Many farms were on the verge of bankruptcy, and the restoration of agricultural infrastructure required significant financial investment and time. The economic damage included not only direct destruction, ruined houses, industrial facilities, and transport arteries, but also long-term losses: reduced crop yields, job losses, falling incomes in farming communities, and the need for large-scale restoration of engineering systems. The disaster was accompanied by political and public resonance. The causes of the destruction, issues of responsibility and emergency preparedness were discussed. Theories about technical defects, operational errors, and external influences were put forward, and existing monitoring and warning systems were criticized. In the first days after the tragedy, efforts were focused on rescuing people and minimizing the humanitarian consequences. Temporary accommodation centers were set up, drinking water, food and medicines were delivered, and volunteers and international organizations joined in to deliver aid and restore basic services. As the water receded, specialists were faced with the tasks of assessing the damage, cleaning up the areas and planning restoration work. Silt and debris had to be cleared, contaminated materials disposed of, infrastructure repaired, and water supply and sewage systems restored, as well as environmental studies conducted to assess the long-term impact on soil and groundwater. Ecologists and hydrologists warned of the risk of long-term ecosystem transformations. Changes in water flows, degradation of floodplain landscapes, and possible soil salinization could render some areas unsuitable for previous land uses without costly rehabilitation measures. At the same time, legal and administrative procedures were launched. Investigations began to establish the causes of the destruction, analyze projects and operational documentation, and check the state of technical maintenance and the availability of early warning tools. The public demanded transparency and accountability, and those affected sought compensation and support. In response to the disaster, recovery and adaptation programs were initiated. The development of projects for the reconstruction of the dam and related structures, taking into account new safety standards, the creation of real-time monitoring systems, the introduction of modern flood forecasting methods and evacuation plans for vulnerable settlements. The social component of the recovery was also important. In addition to repairing buildings and infrastructure, it was necessary to rebuild people's lives, provide psychological assistance, revive the local economy, and support vulnerable groups of the population. International organizations offered assistance and expertise in environmental, construction, and humanitarian support issues, while civil initiatives and foundations raised funds and organized local aid programs. The disaster at the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station was a painful lesson in the fragility of engineering infrastructure in the face of natural and man-made challenges, reminding us of the need to invest in prevention, monitoring, and preparedness for extreme situations. The consequences of this tragedy will be felt for years to come. The ecosystems of the lower Dnieper have been destroyed, the soil has been salinated, farmers have lost their livelihoods, and recovery will require significant investment and time. On August 6, 2024, in southern Sudan, near the port of Sudan, one of the most devastating water accidents in the region occurred. The Arbit Dam, which held water for irrigation and local infrastructure, could not withstand the pressure after prolonged and intense rainfall, and its collapse turned the nearby valleys into raging torrents, sweeping away everything in their path. Within hours, the water covered settlements, roads, and fields, and the consequences were catastrophic. According to official reports, more than 140 people died, about 20 villages were destroyed, and thousands of families were left without shelter and livelihoods. The evacuation took place under extreme conditions. Destroyed bridges and washed-out roads prevented the rapid delivery of aid, so rescue teams used boats, harbor boats, and sometimes helicopters to transport people from the islands where they were stranded after the water receded. Medical centers and temporary shelters were set up by volunteers and humanitarian organizations. The injured were taken to field hospitals, and psychological support was provided to those affected. But the humanitarian mission faced serious logistical challenges. Many areas remained cut off, food and clean water supplies were running out fast, and the sanitation situation was getting worse because of contaminated water sources and broken sewage systems. The environmental consequences were no less dramatic. The floodwaters washed away fertile topsoil, destroyed crops and pastures, and carried away domestic and industrial waste, as well as containers of building materials and fertilizers, leading to long-term pollution and threats to the health of residents and the natural environment. The habitats of many animals disappeared, and bird and fish populations suffered a sharp decline, which scientists estimated would result in a loss of biodiversity for years to come. The socio-economic consequences included the ruin of small farms, falling incomes and job losses. Trade and supply in the affected areas almost came to a standstill. Local leaders and residents demanded an immediate and transparent investigation into the causes of the collapse. Complaints emerged about underfunding and inadequate supervision of the condition of hydraulic structures, reports of cracks and leaks that had previously been ignored, and poor coordination between municipal and national agencies. The exposure of these problems sparked a wave of public outrage and demands for the resignation of responsible officials, as well as calls for international assistance to rebuild the infrastructure. The technical investigation pointed to a combination of factors: extreme rainfall and increased water inflow, structural defects and material wear, inadequate maintenance, and errors in water discharge management, which together created a critical situation. Engineers recommended revising dam design and maintenance standards, introducing mandatory monitoring of the condition of structures using modern sensors and early warning systems, as well as developing evacuation plans in conjunction with local communities and conducting regular drills. International humanitarian organizations responded immediately. Tents, hygiene supplies, medicines, and drinking water were delivered to the region, along with experts in restoration and environmental damage assessment. However, recovery promised to be a long process. Rebuilding homes, infrastructure, water supply, and irrigation systems required significant financial investment and time, as well as overcoming bureaucratic barriers. Self-help initiatives emerged at the local level. Communities organized support centers, distributed resources, and helped evacuees to get their lives back on track, demonstrating solidarity in difficult times. Among the stories of individuals were examples of incredible courage: residents who risked their lives to save neighbors, volunteers who worked tirelessly, and rescuers who returned to dangerous areas to save one more person. Political discussions after the disaster focused on the need to invest in sustainable infrastructure and adaptation to climate change, which is making such extreme rainfall more frequent. Experts emphasized that simply rebuilding the old dam without taking future climate risks into account and without modernizing it would not provide long-term safety and would only delay a repeat of the tragedy. Ultimately, the Arbit tragedy became a lesson and an impetus for reform. Programs were planned to reconstruct hydraulic structures in line with higher standards, create a national monitoring system and funds for emergency work, and develop educational programs for the population on how to behave during floods and how to carry out evacuations. Nevertheless, many concerns remained: where to get sufficient funding, how to ensure transparency and control over expenditures, and how to restore lost ecosystems and people's trust. Memorials were erected to commemorate the victims, and civil society organizations launched campaigns to raise funds and provide legal support to those affected. Compensation and insurance programs for affected families were discussed, but many noted that actual payments and property restoration would take years. Proposals emerged for regional cooperation on water resource management and the exchange of technical expertise between neighboring countries to increase resilience to future disasters, and universities and research centers received grants to study the consequences and develop adaptation technologies. Practice has shown that an integrated approach, combining engineering solutions, environmental rehabilitation, and social support, is the only viable path to recovery and long-term risk reduction. The story of Arbit has been included in national and international reports as an example of what happens when prevention is neglected and early warnings are ignored, and has become a call to action to avoid similar tragedies in the future. When the disaster finally recedes, what remains is not only ruins. Memories remain. Every stone of the destroyed dam, every crack in the concrete is a reminder of the price of human error and how fragile everything we consider reliable can be. Disasters at dams and hydroelectric power stations are not just stories about water and engineering. They are stories about people who fought to the last, about rescuers who risked their lives for others, and about families who lost everything in a matter of moments. After each such breach, the world becomes quieter and people become more attentive, although, unfortunately, not for long. Where yesterday life was bustling, today there is only a desert of silt and debris, and somewhere under the thick layer of mud, houses, roads, and destinies still lie. But even amid this chaos, there is still hope. Hope for recovery, for new technologies, for mistakes not to be repeated. Engineers are building new protection systems. Environmentalists are trying to restore nature's balance, and eyewitnesses to these events are sharing their stories so that humanity will never forget the price of carelessness. Water is the greatest force on the planet, and humans are still learning to coexist with it. Every destroyed concrete giant is a reminder that no technology can completely conquer the elements. We can only respect its power and be prepared for its return. May the memory of dam tragedies serve not only as a warning, but also as a lesson. After all, if the past teaches us nothing, it is bound to repeat itself. And then the wave will rise again, sweeping away everything that man thought was eternal. Therefore, it is important to remember that the power of water lies not in destruction, but in reminding us how dependent we are on nature and how we must be ready to listen to it. These were the 5 most terrible disasters at dams and dikes. Stories that showed that the elements do not forgive carelessness. Take care of yourselves and appreciate every day when the water is calm.